Welcome to my presentation entitled Towards Transforming Tabular Datasets into Knowledge Graphs. This research is done by Fusion and Computer Vision Group, Friedrich Schiller University Jena, and presented in the European Conference on Semantic Web, ESWC 2020. Why should we care about tabular datasets transformation into knowledge graphs? Let's consider this example. Here we have a snippet from a biodiversity dataset in a CSV file. Now the task is to find the abundance of earthworms where the pH value is greater than 4. Actually, this dataset is not directly queryable nor usable. So if you decided to answer such a question by manually looking inside the dataset, answering this question might cost a few years, especially if you are working on a multiple large-scale and heterogeneous datasets. So, converting this tabular data into a knowledge graph could be a solution for such a problem. But in fact, the tabular dataset might suffer from a lack of descriptive information for such conversion. Moreover, other pieces of useful data might persist outside the dataset itself. For example, in metadata or in a publication related to such a dataset. So this project aims at automatic transformation of tabular dataset into knowledge graphs using machine learning techniques. Such techniques help in mappings learning or concepts and relations prediction. The rest of the outlook will be the state of the art, the problem statement and the contributions, then the research approach and methodology, followed by the evaluation plan, afterwards our initial experiments and results, finally the conclusion and future work. As long as the end goal of the project is a knowledge graph construction from tabular data and auxiliary data, like publication for instance, here we divide the related work into two main categories, table and text understanding. For table understanding, there are automatic and semi-automatic approaches. The four systems under the automatic approaches are presented in the Semantic Web Challenge SimTab 2019. These systems aim at mappings creation for cells as entities, column types, and column pair properties. Such mappings are supposed to be generated from DBpedia. Meanwhile, text understanding includes two main tasks: named entity recognition and relation extraction. Both involve concepts and relations prediction, respectively. For successful data reuse, a good ideal machine-readable description of the data is essential. The desired descriptions are represented as a knowledge graph. However, creating such descriptions requires considerable manual effort. Our core research problem is how to enable the reusability of tabular data by adopting and extending machine learning techniques. We believe that building such a knowledge graph automatically will be only possible by leveraging auxiliary information besides the dataset itself. The essential sources of information are metadata and the publication beside the dataset itself. Since there is a massive amount of biodiversity data available, we choose it as our first domain of interest. Our overall contribution is to enable the automatic integration of tabular datasets into knowledge graphs. This overall contribution is divided into 4 items. At first, we will develop methods that take a tabular dataset as an input and automatically create a knowledge graph out of it. In fact, these methods will determine the meaning of individual columns and the relationships among the column pairs. The second thing is we will extend these tools to leverage the auxiliary information from metadata and publications. Afterwards, we will integrate these tools into a single framework. And finally, we will evaluate the individual methods as well as the final system. In the first step of our research pipeline, we conducted several meetings with domain experts from biodiversity field for requirement gathering. Based on their requirements, we came up with 3 main stages for our project. Firstly, we aim to build a knowledge graph from the tabular dataset as a standalone data source. So, we will perform a complete development lifecycle from the analysis of the state-of-the-art and the concept development to implementation, evaluation, and publication. This cycle will be repeated after adding the information of the metadata and publication. After the completion of the project, a user study will be undertaken. Our proposed conceptual view model for the first stage starts with a CSV file as an input. The preprocessing step involves the header and column extraction and a step for cleaning the cell values. The extracted columns shall be divided into object and non-object columns, where object or entity columns could be defined as columns that might have entries on a knowledge base like Wikipedia. In our example here, country and city are the object columns. Meanwhile, the area column is the non-object column. The first main module here is the concept prediction, which involves various methods like lookup-based services and named entity recognition. The output of this module, if we consider the DBpedia is the target ontology, will be DBO country and DBO city. Both of the predicted concepts and the non-object columns together contribute towards the semantic relationships, which is the second core module of the framework. In our example, DBO area and DBO capital are the candidate properties or semantic relationships. In practical cases, more than one mapping candidate per column type or relationship would be generated. So a filtering step is needed to pick the most suitable mapping. Finally, the filtered concepts and relations are then fed into the last main module, which builds the knowledge graph schema and populates the instances. If we recall the research approach here, we can see that our evaluation plan includes 2 types of assessments. The first one is done after each stage, where it involves the performance evaluation of the developed methods using the standard matrices and benchmark datasets from the state-of-the-art. The second type is the user-based evaluation or the user satisfaction assessment. We will hold it at the very last stage of the project by preparing a questions list where the metric is the retrieved answers. Such kind of evaluation assures the existence of the information inside the resultant knowledge graph. We have conducted an initial experiment that infers a knowledge graph schema from the table headers only. Our hypothesis is to find the concepts of interest and the relations among them using a clustering technique, such that cluster names nominate graph concepts while cluster members show the semantic relationships. For example, if we have a cluster named author, with two members like author_name and author_email, this cluster can yield into two triples like the one below. SWORM dataset is used in our experiments, such that this dataset is about earthworms in different geographical sites in a range of years. We have included the headers with at least one meaningful word. For example, bio_10 and bio_15 are excluded. At the end, we have 38 headers in total. The pipeline behind our experiments consists of several steps. At first, a list of headers are fed into a parser, which tries to find the words inside a human-made header. The list of words are then converted into vectors. In this step, we included two types of vector representation. The first one is the syntactic representation, which basically the plain text itself, while the second one is the semantic representation by using the word embeddings. These vectors are then clustered based on their similarity. In the next step, we let the user merge some clusters or move items from one cluster to another. Afterwards, nominate name would try to find a common word among the cluster members and select it as a cluster name. In the next phase, the user can revise the clusters and override the auto-generated name. Finally, the user can export the output as an RDF XML file. The plot on the right shows the cosine distance of the headers. As we can see, the syntactic representation decides that most of the headers are close together. Unlike the semantic results here, headers are very far from each other. To summarize the results, the semantic representation yield into more fine-grained clusters, and yet less mistakes compared to the syntactic representation, but of course such vectors are higher in dimension. The number of mistakes shown here is compared by a manually created schema for the same dataset. The main takeaways from this presentation are: we have proposed a knowledge graph construction framework which contains 3 main modules. Besides, we have shown our initial results for knowledge graph schema construction using table headers. In the next steps, we plan to leverage the column cells besides the headers to build the knowledge graph. Last but not least, I'd like to thank my supervisors, Professor Dr. Birgitta Koenig-Ries, Professor Dr. Joachim Densler, and Dr. Shiba Samuel for their continuous guidance and support. As well as, I'd like to thank Dr. Olaf Hartig for his valuable feedback.